Well, StoryCare is a very interesting product for a lot of reasons. First of all, there's a huge need in healthcare. If you look out at the environment of healthcare today and all the kinds of improvement processes that are going on, the emphasis on making change, the emphasis on reducing errors, improving satisfaction of patients, the challenge is how do you do that in an environment where there are so many demands being placed on staff? They have all kinds of requirements every day. We know staff are terribly stressed. And if you tell staff, well, we got to do another X thousand hours of training, we know that it's not going to work. And the problem with training is the training is very good at introducing people to concepts, but it's not very good at sustaining behaviors. So when we were looking at the concept of how do we make an improvement in healthcare, it actually started a few years ago when the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services came out and said, we're going to start asking hospitals to evaluate the job they're doing satisfying patients. And there's an assessment tool called HCAHPS, which everyone's familiar with in healthcare today, and about 20 questions, pretty simple and straightforward. Did your nurse communicate with you? Did your doctor communicate with you? Did they manage your pain well? Was the room kept clean? Was the noise level kept low enough so that you could rest? Did they educate you well enough about your needs that when they discharged you? Real basic stuff. And hospitals have been asking satisfaction questions for a long time. They've hired their own private companies, but now they had to ask these additional 20 questions. And CMS said, hey, if you want to get reimbursement, you have to ask these questions. And just this year, they have told hospitals that the hospitals that are in the lowest 50th percentile on their answers to these questions are going to get dinged 2% of their Medicare reimbursement. So now there's a huge stick. And hospitals are suddenly, at least hospital CEOs, are beginning to sit up and say, oh, geez, patient satisfaction matters. And we know from our research that actually patient satisfaction and patient safety are integrally related to each other. Hospitals which do a good job of satisfying their patients tend to be safer hospitals. There are fewer errors, fewer incidents where patients are harmed. So we started looking at this a few years ago, and our first impulse as a company who makes training and class A training, really terrific training, was, we'll create another e-delivered training course that everybody can go through. And the more we looked at it, there were already people who had rushed into the market with their own training, much of it which we thought was pretty mediocre. But once again, it was the problem that we were going to take nurses or doctors or other professionals out of the workplace, to have them go, even though they were going to go online on a computer, but they were going to have to take a half an hour, whatever, out of their time to go get some training. And then the question was, once they got the training, yes, they're introduced to the concept, yes, we should communicate with patients. It's not brain surgery. But what keeps them focused on doing that day in and day out in the midst of all the other stressful demands they have? So we said, that doesn't seem like a route to go. So actually, in a meeting that Duncan Kennedy and I were in with our friends here at Avatar International, we were having this discussion, and I hearkened back to some of my early days with storytelling when I worked with a woman who's named Paula Underwood, who was Native American, and she came from the Oneida tradition. And in their tradition, the way they started teaching children from a very, very early age was with stories. They called them learning stories. And so they would tell a story to a child at about age 3, and they would ask a very simple question at the conclusion of the story. What might we learn from this story? Or what might you learn from this story? And then the teller would shut up. They wouldn't say anymore. They just say, what could you learn from this story? And so a 3-year-old would hear one of her famous stories is Who Speaks for Wolf, which is a story about a people who had outgrown where they were living. There was no longer enough resources for them, and they had to move. And they sent scouts out in 4 directions, and the scouts came back, each reporting about the things they had seen, and some reported about clear running waters, and another reported about a place for their 3 sisters, beans, corn, and squash, with wonderful fields, and others talked about high, dry places where they could build their long houses, and so the people would listen, and they were making decisions, and they finally came to a decision. And they had a consensus model, what we would call a consensus model today, and then someone stood up and said, what about Wolf's brother? He hasn't returned. He was one of the scouts. And he was known as Wolf's brother because he had a particular understanding of the wolf. They called them people, the wolf people, but he understood wolf and could tell you stories about wolf and explain why wolf would often come to the edge of the light of a fire at the end of the night. And because he was as curious about people as people were curious about him. And the chief said, well, we don't have any more time. We're out of time. We've got to move. We don't know if maybe he was killed by a bear or, he's been caught in a late summer storm, winter storm. So we have to move. And so people began preparing to move, and they sent an advance party. And then Wolf's brother showed up. And he said, when he learned where they were going to move, he said, this is a very bad decision because you've chosen a place where a great community of wolves lives. And he said, well, certainly we have accommodated Wolf all these years. Wolf can accommodate us this one time. But Wolf's brother counseled, said, this is a very bad decision. I don't think you should do that. I think really you ought to reconsider the decision. But the people, they closed their ears, they didn't want to listen, and they moved. And it was everything they wanted, except no one saw that Wolf was watching them. And one day, a hunter came and leaned his catch against one of the longhouses, went in to fetch a container, and when he came out, Wolf was dragging it away. So the people got together and said, well, this is a problem. And so they decided they would feed Wolf. They would leave food at the edge of the village for Wolf as a kind of payment for the land. And so they did that. And pretty soon Wolf, though, became bolder. And the next thing you know, wolves were wandering among the longhouses with the children. And the women were berserk about this. They said, we can't have this. We can't have this. And so they gathered and said, you're right. And so they put sentries around the village. And they forced the wolves away, and they kept them away. But the problem was winter was coming, and she who was in charge of winter stores came to the elders and said, I don't think we have enough food to get through a difficult winter. So everybody got together, and they saw that they were sort of created their own problem, that feeding Wolf was a problem because they were using their own resources. Keeping men there to keep Wolf away, they could be out hunting and gathering food, but now they were keeping Wolf away. And they saw the error of their ways. And so they always then, from then on, would not only consider Wolf, but they realized there were things that they did not know that they did not know. And they would always, at the end of every discussion, say, tell me now, my sisters, tell me now, my brothers, who speaks for Wolf? And then they would ask at the end of that story, they would say, what might you learn from this story? What might you learn from this story? And then they would shut up. Unlike in our educational models where we might tell people a story and then tell them what it means. That's the old, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. They wouldn't do that. And they understood what I think we've come to understand today in learning is that when you combine story with reflection, that's where real learning happens. And there's a lot of research now that substantiates that. So we began asking the question, what if we could create a product in which we could have a story that could be told to the staff, and then we could ask them a couple simple questions that would engage them with the story and its relevance for their circumstances. And that's really the heart of what StoryCare is about, is actually taking powerful stories that are about real problems in healthcare, either related to safety or the quality of care or patient satisfaction or teamwork among staff. And the stories are usually 2 to 3 minutes long. They are based on real things that have happened in healthcare settings. And then those stories are turned into audio versions, very highly engineered. Our engineer, Rob Hill, here does a terrific job of providing sound effects so that they're really immersive. There's an immersive experience as you're listening to them. One of the interesting things we found was that most hospitals, they don't have lots of big video monitors. They don't even have speakers on their computers. If you walk around a hospital, you'll suddenly look around the nurses' stations. There are no speakers. So we give people inexpensive sets of speakers that they can plug into their computer so they can play the story. But if you have 30 nurses sitting around the nurses' station, they can't really watch a monitor and see a story well. So we have the flexibility to quickly create new stories, write it, go in, record it, and move it into the website where the story is streamed. And this website is set up as a library. And so I can search by my department. Let's say I'm in labor and delivery. I can click labor and delivery, and let's say I'm interested in patient safety. I click patient safety, and then it'll give me a list of possible outcomes I might be interested in around patient safety. And I'll say, I'm interested in this one. And then the library will feed up and say, oh, we've got 3 stories that are just about that topic. And then I can go and listen to the story, read it. There's a discussion guide that guides me how to facilitate that story with my team. So the basic process is I play the story for my team. We ask some simple questions. We engage the team to look at its relevance for them and what they can do and change in their own practice right there in that setting. And then I, as a leader, over the next 2 weeks, will round with them. So as I round around the floor, I might say to you, so Jennifer, what do you think about that story? And what are you doing to better communicate with your patient? And you might go, well, I've tried this and this. And I say, well, that's great. How's it going? And you say, well, this worked really well with this patient. Not as well with that patient. Oh, that's interesting. And then in 2 weeks, we bring everybody back together. We all come back together. And we find out what people learn trying new behaviors and what seemed to work best. And then I'll say, I tell you what, I'd like everyone to try something they haven't tried that they heard today. Try it out for the next couple weeks. And let's experiment, and let's come back in another 2 weeks, and I'll be checking in with you. And at that time, we'll bring our heads together, and we'll decide which of the things that we've tried should be our best practice as a team. And then we're going to adopt that. So people return in 4 weeks, they share their best practices, and they arrive at one, and the team adopts that and says, that's what we're going to do. And then they can move on to a new improvement area. So StoryCare becomes a continuous improvement process. It's what we call rapid cycle. It takes 4 weeks to move through it quickly, and then you're on to a new behavior. And we think that this will become really the kind of benchmark for really exciting new processes for change. So that's what StoryCare is all about.